Jake Martinez stared out the transport window at the massive space station floating in the darkness. Sentinel Prime was bigger than anything he had ever seen, a city made of metal and light, hanging in the void between stars. Somewhere inside that structure, he would begin his training as a soldier for the Galactic Coalition. The thought made his stomach twist with nerves and excitement. He was 19 years old and had never left Earth until 3 days ago. Now he was millions of miles from home, surrounded by aliens who barely acknowledged that humans existed. The other passengers on the transport were all recruits like him, but none of them were human. There was a Crindax sitting across from him, a massive creature covered in thick scales that looked like living armor. The thing was at least 8 feet tall, even while sitting down. Next to the Crindax sat a Vexori, which had 4 arms and a face that reminded Jake of an insect. There were others, too, species he had only seen in training videos back on Earth. None of them spoke to him. Most of them did not even look at him. Jake tried not to let it bother him. He knew what humanity's reputation was in the galaxy. They were the new species, the weak ones, the fragile, soft bodies who died if the temperature got too hot or too cold. Humans had only made contact with the galactic community 5 years ago, and most aliens still thought of Earth as a backwater planet full of primitives. The transport docked with a heavy clang that echoed through the hull. Jake grabbed his bag and followed the other recruits through the airlock and into the station. The inside of Sentinel Prime was even more impressive than the outside. The corridors were wide enough to fit the largest species comfortably, and the ceiling was so high that Jake felt like he was walking through a canyon. Holographic signs floated in the air, pointing directions in dozens of different languages. Jake's translator implant fed him the information directly into his brain, a weird tickling sensation behind his eyes. They were herded into a large assembly hall where hundreds of other recruits were already waiting. An instructor stood at the front, a Crindax even bigger than the one on the transport. The instructor's scales were darker, almost black, and covered with scars that told stories of old battles. When the instructor spoke, his voice boomed through the hall like thunder. "I am Commander Thorak. You are here because your worlds believe you can be warriors. Most of you are wrong. Most of you will fail. Some of you will die. The Galactic Coalition does not need soldiers who are merely adequate. We need the best. If you are not the best, you will be sent home in shame." Jake felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. Around him, the other recruits stood straighter, their faces set with determination. He tried to match their confidence, but it was hard when he was barely 5'9" and most of the room towered over him. The instructor began calling out assignments, sorting recruits into training squads. The best and brightest were sent to elite groups with famous instructors. The strong Crindax warriors went to Squad Alpha. The swift Pelian scouts went to Squad Delta. The armored Vexori went to Squad Gamma. Jake listened as name after name was called, watching the hall slowly empty. Finally, only a handful of recruits remained. The instructor looked at them with something that might have been pity or disgust. "The rest of you are Squad Omega. Follow Instructor Ven." A smaller alien stepped forward, a Pelian with gray skin and large eyes. Instructor Ven looked tired, like someone who had given up on life a long time ago. He gestured for them to follow and led them through the corridors without saying a word. Squad Omega consisted of 5 recruits. There was Jake, the human. There was Vorak, a Crindax who was smaller than others of his kind and walked with a limp. There was Quillix, a nervous Pelian who kept adjusting his equipment with shaking hands. There was Drashin, a Vexori, who had only 3 arms instead of 4, the missing limb ending in a scarred stump. And there was Lisa Chen, another human, a woman with short black hair and eyes that constantly scanned their surroundings like she was expecting an attack. They were the rejects, the ones who did not fit, the ones nobody wanted. Their barracks was a small room, with bunks that were too large for the humans and too small for Vorak. The walls were bare metal, and the air smelled like recycled oxygen and cleaning chemicals. Nobody spoke as they claimed their beds and unpacked their few belongings. Training began the next morning before dawn, though there was no real dawn on a space station. They were roused by alarms and ordered to the training grounds, a massive facility that could simulate any environment in the galaxy. Today it was set to a standard obstacle course. Jake stood at the starting line and looked at what he had to face. Walls 3 times his height. Gaps too wide to jump. Climbing nets designed for species with claws. Balance beams too narrow for human feet. Everything was built for aliens, and none of it was built for him. "Begin!" Instructor Venn shouted. Jake ran. He tried to climb the first wall but could not reach the handholds. He tried to jump the first gap but fell short and landed hard on the safety mat below. He tried the climbing net but his hands slipped on the alien material. By the time he finished the course, he was dead last. His hands were bleeding. His legs shook with exhaustion. And from the observation deck above, he could hear laughter. Other squads had gathered to watch. They pointed at the humans, struggling through obstacles that were easy for them. They made jokes in languages the translator could not quite catch. They recorded videos on their devices, probably to share with friends and mock the weak Terrans who thought they could be warriors. Lisa finished just ahead of Jake, her face red with anger and shame. Vorak came in third from last, his injured leg making the jumps difficult. Kilix and Drashin had barely finished at all. "Pathetic," Instructor Venn said, though his voice held no real emotion. "Run it again." They ran it again, and again, and again. By the end of the day, Jake had failed the course 12 times. His body hurt everywhere. His hands were wrapped in bandages. His muscles screamed for rest. But he had also learned something. Each time he ran the course, he found new ways to approach the obstacles. He learned which handholds were strong enough for human grip. He learned how to use momentum to make jumps he could not make with strength alone. He learned that being small meant he could fit through spaces the larger aliens could not use. That night, lying in his bunk, Jake heard Vorak speak for the first time. "Why are you here, human? You cannot win. Your species is not made for war." Jake thought about that question. He thought about Earth, about his family, about the future he wanted to help build. "Maybe we are not made for war," he said quietly. "But we are here anyway, and I am not leaving." From across the room, Lisa laughed softly. "Damn right we are not leaving." Vorak grunted and said nothing more, but Jake thought maybe, just maybe, he heard a hint of respect in that grunt. It was not much, but it was a start. 3 weeks into training, something changed at Sentinel Prime. Word spread through the station like wildfire. The Vraks had sent a representative. Not just any Vraks, but Kael'thor himself, the Endless Knight, the undefeated champion, the warrior whose name was spoken in whispers even by the bravest soldiers in the galaxy. Jake had heard stories about the Vraks during his orientation on Earth. They were the galaxy's ultimate warriors, a species that lived for combat. Their culture revolved around honor, strength, and the constant testing of skill. They rarely involved themselves in coalition politics, appearing only when wars needed to be won or when something interested them. For one of them to visit the academy was strange. For Kael'thor to visit was unprecedented. The legendary warrior arrived without ceremony. One day he simply appeared in the observation deck above the main training hall, a tall figure with midnight blue skin that seemed to absorb light. He wore simple armor that bore the marks of 1,000 battles, Across his arms and chest were ritual scars, each one representing a worthy opponent defeated in honorable combat. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands. His eyes were solid black, revealing nothing, and when he moved, it was with a grace that made even the Kryndax warriors look clumsy. Kyle said nothing. He simply watched. The instructors were terrified, though they tried to hide it. They made the training harder, pushed the recruits further, desperate to impress the watching legend. The top students began showing off, volunteering for the most dangerous exercises, attempting feats that bordered on reckless. Terran, the son of a Kryndax commander, started challenging the advanced combat simulations meant for veterans. He fought holographic enemies with spectacular moves, roaring his victories for everyone to hear. Xerix, a Vexori prodigy, broke 3 academy records in a single day, using all 4 of her arms to demonstrate complex weapon techniques. Even recruits from other species pushed themselves to the limit, hoping to catch the eye of the endless night. But Squad Omega was not in the main training hall. They were in the auxiliary facility, a smaller room where the rejects practiced away from the judging eyes of their peers. Jake was grateful for that. He had enough trouble with the training without worrying about being watched by a legend. Today, they were running combat simulations. Jake stood in the hollow chamber, facing a projection of a Kryndax warrior. The simulation was set to recruit level, which meant it was supposed to be beatable. Jake had been trying to beat it for 2 hours. So far, he had failed 11 times. The holographic Kryndax charged. Jake dodged left, trying to get inside the creature's reach where his size might be an advantage. The simulation adapted, sweeping low with a clawed hand. Jake jumped, but not fast enough. The claws caught his leg, and the simulation ended with his projected death. Again. "Reset," Jake said, breathing hard. "Martinez, you should rest," Instructor Venn called from outside the chamber. "You have been at this too long." "One more time," Jake replied. He studied how he had died. The Kryndax had adapted to his dodge pattern. That meant he needed to change his approach. Maybe if he feinted right first, then went left, he could throw off the prediction algorithm. "Reset," he said again. What Jake did not know was that he was no longer training alone. In the observation room above the auxiliary facility, a figure stood in the shadows. Thor had left the main hall and found his way to the smaller training areas, guided by something he could not quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or instinct. The Vrax warrior watched as the small human faced the simulation again, and failed again, and requested a reset again. Thor's expression did not change, but something stirred in his ancient mind. Recognition, perhaps. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Thor appeared in the observation decks during training exercises, but his attention increasingly drifted from the main hall to the auxiliary facility. He watched Squad Omega run their drills. He watched them fail at obstacles. He watched them struggle with simulations that other recruits passed easily, and he watched Jake Martinez get back up over and over and over again. The other instructors noticed. "Why does he watch the failures?" one asked. "Perhaps he finds their incompetence amusing," another suggested. But Instructor Venn, who had been teaching rejects for 20 years, saw something different. He saw the way Thor's head tilted when Jake adapted his tactics. He saw the subtle shift in the warrior's posture when Lisa refused to yield in a hand-to-hand drill despite being badly outmatched. He saw the ancient warrior lean forward slightly when Vorak used his injured leg as a deceptive weakness to win a sparring match. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of training, Jake was in the medical bay getting his shoulder examined. He had dislocated it during a climbing exercise, and the doctor, a Pelian with gentle hands, was making sure it was properly set. "You should take a rest day tomorrow," the doctor advised. "Your body is not designed for this level of stress." "I will be fine," Jake said, rotating his shoulder experimentally. It hurt, but it worked. "I have simulations to run." The doctor sighed. "You humans are stubborn." "Yes," Jake agreed with a small smile. "We are." He left the medical bay and headed toward the barracks. The corridors were quiet at this hour, most recruits already asleep or studying in their rooms. Jake was alone with his thoughts, reviewing the day's failures and planning tomorrow's attempts. That is when he saw the figure standing in the corridor ahead. Kael'thor stood motionless, his dark form almost invisible in the dim lighting. Jake froze, his heart suddenly pounding. He had never been this close to the legendary warrior. Up close, Kael'thor was even more intimidating. He radiated power, not in a threatening way, but simply as a fact of his existence. This was a being who had fought for 300 years and never lost. For a long moment, neither moved. Jake did not know what to do. Should he bow, salute, run away? Then Kael'thor spoke. His voice was deep and quiet, like distant thunder. The translator in Jake's head struggled with the words, the Vrax language being notoriously difficult to render in other tongues. "You train in the small room," Kael'thor said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," Jake managed to say. His mouth was dry. "You fail often." Jake felt his face burn with embarrassment. "Yes, sir." "Why do you continue?" Jake blinked. Of all the questions he expected, that was not one of them. He thought about how to answer, thought about giving some noble speech about duty or honor, but something about those solid black eyes made him speak the simple truth instead. "Because I want to be better than I am," Jake said. "And the only way to get better is to keep trying." Kael'thor stared at him for a long time. Jake forced himself not to look away, though every instinct told him to lower his eyes before this predator. Finally, the Vrax warrior did something unexpected. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might have been approval. "Interesting," Kael'thor said softly. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps silent despite his size. Jake stood in the corridor for several minutes after the warrior disappeared, trying to understand what had just happened. He had no way of knowing that he had just passed the first test, or that Kael'thor had found what he was looking for. The announcement came during morning formation. Commander Thorak stood before the assembled recruits, but for once, he was not the most important person in the room. Kael'thor stood beside him, silent and imposing, his presence making even the massive Kryndax commander seem small. "Kael'thor of the Rax has offered a great honor to this academy," Thorak announced, his voice carrying across the hall. "He will conduct the trial of blood, a sacred warrior tradition of his people. Any recruit who wishes may face him in single combat. The trial ends when you yield, when you are unable to continue, or when you land a meaningful strike against him." Excited whispers filled the hall. The trial of blood was legendary among warriors. It was said that fewer than 100 beings in the entire galaxy had ever landed a strike on Kael'thor. Those who did earned respect that lasted lifetimes. Those who tried and failed at least earned the honor of having fought the endless night himself. "The trial will begin tomorrow," Thorak continued. "Those who wish to participate must register by tonight. Think carefully before volunteering. Kael'thor will not kill you, but he will hurt you. This is not a game. This is war made personal." The moment formation ended, recruits rushed to register. Terran was first in line, his scales gleaming with polish and his eyes bright with ambition. Zarex registered seconds later. Within an hour, 43 recruits had volunteered, all of them from the elite squads. All of them were the Academy's best fighters. Squad Omega gathered in their barracks that evening. Nobody spoke about the trial. It was understood that it was not for recruits like them. The trial of blood was for warriors who had a chance, however small, of landing that strike. It was not for failures and rejects. Jake sat on his bunk, thinking. He had watched recordings of Thor's past trials, studying them the way he studied his combat simulations. The Vrax warrior was impossibly skilled, his movements precise and efficient. He never wasted energy. He read his opponents like books, adapting to their tactics before they fully formed. Fighting him was like fighting a force of nature. But Jake had also noticed something else in those recordings. Every opponent who lasted more than a few seconds was someone who tried something unexpected. The ones who relied on their natural advantages, their strength or speed or armor, fell quickly. The ones who adapted, who changed their approach mid-fight, lasted longer. Not much longer, but longer. "I am going to register," Jake said quietly. The room fell silent. Vorak looked up from sharpening his claws. Quillick stopped tinkering with his equipment. Drashin turned his three-eyed gaze on the human. Lisa, who was reading on her bunk, lowered her datapad. "That is suicide," Vorak said flatly. "No, it is a learning opportunity," Jake replied. "When else will I get the chance to fight the best warrior in the galaxy?" "You will not fight him," Drashin said. "You will be destroyed in seconds. He will break you like a toy." "Probably," Jake admitted. "But maybe I will learn something before he does." Lisa swung down from her bunk. "If you are going, I am going too." "Lisa, you do not have to," Jake started. "I know I do not have to," she interrupted. "But I want to. For the same reason you do. We did not come all the way out here to hide in the shadows." Vorak grunted. "Humans are insane." "Yes," Jake said with a slight smile. "We are." They registered that night. When their names appeared on the roster, the other recruits laughed. The humans were going to fight Thor. The weak, fragile, soft-skinned humans thought they could face the endless night. It was the funniest thing anyone had heard all year. The trials began the next morning in the main combat arena. Thousands of recruits, instructors, and station personnel gathered to watch. Thor stood in the center of the ring, unarmed and unarmored except for his simple combat gear. He looked relaxed, almost bored. The first challenger was Terran. The Krindax was huge, powerful, trained since childhood in the warrior arts of his people. He entered the ring with confidence, his muscles rippling under his scales. The crowd cheered. The fight lasted 18 seconds. Thor moved like liquid shadow, slipping past Theron's powerful strikes as if they were moving in slow motion. He tapped Theron's knee, his elbow, his neck, each touch precisely placed. Then he swept the Krindax's legs and put him on the ground with such casual ease that it looked choreographed. Theron yielded, stunned and humiliated. Zarix was next. She used all four arms, creating a whirlwind of attacks that should have been impossible to defend against. Thor defended against them anyway. He did not just block, he redirected, using Zarix's own momentum against her. 32 seconds after the fight began, she was on the ground, two of her arms pinned, gasping for breath. She yielded. One by one, the Academy's best fighters entered the ring. One by one, they were defeated. Some lasted 20 seconds. Some lasted 40. None lasted a full minute. The crowd's enthusiasm gradually turned to awed silence as they witnessed absolute mastery of combat. Then it was Lisa's turn. She lasted 19 seconds, which was respectable for someone half the size of most opponents. She tried to use speed and unpredictability, but Thor had fought fast opponents before. He caught her mid-dodge and put her into a lock she could not escape. She yielded with grace, bowing to the warrior as she left the ring. Finally, the announcer called Jake's name. The crowd, which had been silent with respect, started laughing again. The human boy who could barely pass basic training was going to face the endless night. Some people placed bets on how quickly he would fall. The over-under was 15 seconds. Jake walked into the ring. His hands were shaking slightly, but his expression was calm. He had studied every fight that happened today. He had seen the patterns, the tells, the tiny moments where Kyle Thor adjusted his stance. He knew he could not win, but he could learn. He bowed deeply, showing respect. Kyle Thor returned the bow, his face expressionless. "Begin," the referee called. Jake did not charge. He did not attack. He moved laterally, watching, analyzing. Kyle Thor watched him back, curious about this approach. Most opponents rushed in, eager to prove themselves. This one was thinking. Jake feinted left, then dove right, going low, where Kyle Thor's longer reach would be less effective. The Vrax warrior blocked the move easily, but Jake was already rolling away, creating distance. He had learned from watching Zarex's mistake. Do not commit to attacks that could be redirected. Kyle Thor advanced. Jake retreated, but not in a straight line. He moved at angles, using the space of the ring, making Kyle Thor adjust his approach. It was not working. The warrior was too skilled, but it was forcing him to think about his positioning. 20 seconds passed. Jake changed tactics. He stopped retreating and suddenly rushed forward, low and fast. Kyle Thor prepared to redirect the charge, but Jake dropped and rolled at the last second, trying to get behind the warrior. It almost worked. Almost. Kyle Thor spun and caught Jake's arm mid-roll. The grip was like iron. Jake tried to break free, twisting his body in ways he had practiced for weeks. He almost slipped the grip. Almost. 29 seconds after the fight began, Kyle Thor had Jake pinned to the mat, one arm locked, position completely controlled. Jake could not move. But he did not yield. He was still analyzing the hold, looking for weaknesses, his mind racing through possibilities even though his body was immobilized. "The match is over," Kyle Thor said quietly. His voice meant only for Jake. Jake stopped struggling. He had lost, just like everyone knew he would. He prepared for the walk of shame, for the laughter, for the confirmation that humans did not belong here. But then Kyle Thor did something nobody expected. He helped Jake to his feet personally, gripping his arm in a warrior's clasp. The crowd went silent. The Vrax warrior looked at Jake, really looked at him, and for the first time, something that might have been approval showed in those black eyes. Kyle Thor spoke, his voice carrying across the silent arena. He spoke in his own language, the words ancient and powerful. The translators struggled to render the meaning, but the closest approximation came through. "You fight like one of us." The arena erupted in shocked whispers. A Vrax, comparing another species to their own in combat, was unheard of. For Kyle Thor to do it was impossible. Yet here it stood, the endless night. Holding a human's arm and speaking words of recognition. Jake did not understand the significance. He just knew that something important had happened. Something that would change everything. The day after the trial of blood, Jake received a message on his personal communicator. It was simple and direct. Training Room 7. Dawn. Come alone. Kyle Thor. Jake arrived early, his stomach tight with nerves and excitement. Training Room 7 was one of the private facilities used by instructors and advanced students. He had never been inside before. The door opened at his approach, recognizing his identity, and he stepped into a large open space with padded floors and walls lined with various training equipment. Kyle Thor was already there, standing in the center of the room in a meditation pose. His eyes were closed. his breathing slow and controlled. Jake waited by the door, unsure if he should interrupt. After a few minutes, the Virax warrior opened his eyes and looked at Jake. "You lasted 29 seconds," Kael'thor said. "Do you know why?" Jake thought about the question. "Because you ended the fight?" "Before that. Why did you last as long as you did when others, stronger and faster than you, fell more quickly?" Jake considered this. He had watched the recordings of the trial several times, analyzing his own performance. "I changed tactics. I did not rely on one approach. I adapted." Kael'thor nodded slowly. "Yes, you adapted. This is what makes a warrior, not strength or speed or natural advantages. Those things fade. Bodies grow old, reflexes slow, armor breaks. But the ability to adapt, to learn, to refuse defeat even when defeat is certain, these things do not fade. These things are eternal." He gestured for Jake to come closer. "The Vrax do not measure warriors by what they are born with. We measure them by what they choose to become. You choose to become better each day, even when others mock you. This is why I watch you. This is why I bring you here." Over the following weeks, Jake trained with Kael'thor every morning before his regular squad training began. The sessions were brutal. Kael'thor did not go easy on him. He pushed Jake to his limits and then beyond, forcing him to find solutions when his body was exhausted and his mind was foggy with fatigue. But it was not just physical training. Kael'thor taught Jake the philosophy of Vrax combat. "Fighting is not about destroying your enemy," the warrior explained one morning after Jake had collapsed from exhaustion. "It is about understanding them. Every opponent has a pattern, a rhythm, a way they see the world. If you can understand that, you can adapt to it. And if you can adapt to it, you can defeat it." Jake learned to read body language across dozens of species. He learned that Krindak's warriors tended to favor their dominant side due to their asymmetric muscle structure. He learned that Vexori with 4 arms often neglected their leg defense because they were used to having multiple hands to block with. He learned that Pelions had excellent reaction time, but poor stamina in extended fights. But more importantly, he learned to see beyond species characteristics. He learned to read individuals, to spot the tiny tells that revealed intention before action, a shift in weight, a change in breathing, the micro-expression before a strike. "Your body is weak compared to most species," Kael'thor said during one session. "This is fact, not insult. But your mind is strong. Your ability to learn and adapt is stronger than any species I have encountered in 300 years of war. Humans are survivors. You survive by being smarter, more flexible, more determined than those who should defeat you easily. This is your weapon. Learn to use it." The changes did not come quickly. Jake still failed more than he succeeded. But slowly, gradually, he began to improve. His combat simulation scores rose. His obstacle course times decreased. In sparring matches with his squad, he started winning occasionally instead of losing constantly. The other recruits noticed. The laughter that had followed Squad Omega began to fade. Whispers replaced it. Why was the endless night training a human? What did he see that no one else saw? The elite students, who had been so confident after the trial of blood, began to doubt themselves. If Kael'thor thought this failed human was worth his time, what did that say about the rest of them? Theron approached Jake one day in the mess hall. The big Krindax stood over Jake's table, his expression unreadable. Jake prepared for confrontation, but instead, Theron sat down across from him. "I want to understand," Theron said quietly. "Why you? You are not the fastest, not the strongest. You did not even last longest in the trial. Why does Kael'thor train you?" Jake thought about how to answer. He could have been defensive or proud. Instead, he spoke honestly. I do not think it is about being the best. I think it is about being willing to learn. Every time I fail, I try to understand why. Every time I succeed, I try to understand how. Maybe that is what he saw. Terran was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. That is wisdom I had not considered. My father always taught me that victory comes from strength. But perhaps there is more to it than that. He stood up, but before he left, he placed his clawed hand on Jake's shoulder. It could have been a threat, but it was not. It was respect. Train well, human. You have earned the attention you receive. Not everyone was so accepting. Xerix, the Vexori prodigy, watched Jake with barely concealed jealousy. She had worked her entire life to be the best, and now this human, this weak creature who should not even be at the academy, was being trained by a legend. It was not fair. It made no sense. She confronted Kyle Thor directly one evening, finding him as he left training room 7. "Why him?" she demanded. "I am faster, stronger, more skilled. I have trained since I could walk. What does he have that I do not?" Kyle Thor looked at her with those unreadable black eyes. "You have skill," he said simply. "He has hunger, you have talent. He has will. You fight to prove you are the best. He fights to become better than he was. These are not the same thing." Xerix wanted to argue, but something in the warrior's tone made her reconsider. She thought about his words for days afterward, turning them over in her mind. Eventually, she sought out Jake in the training room and asked if she could observe his sessions. Jake, remembering his own struggles, agreed. Watching Jake train changed Xerix's perspective. She saw him fail a technique 20 times before getting it right. She saw Kelthor push him until he physically could not stand, then demand more anyway. She saw Jake give that more, finding reserves he should not have. And she saw something she had never seen in her own training. Growth that came not from natural talent, but from sheer determination to improve. One morning, Kelthor brought Jake to a different training room, one with high ceilings and aerial obstacles. "Today you will learn something new," the Vrax warrior said. "Today you will learn that failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the path to success. Watch." Kelthor attempted a complex aerial maneuver, something involving 3 different grip points and a spinning rotation. He failed. He fell to the safety mat below and landed hard. Jake was shocked. He had never seen the Endless Knight fail at anything. Kelthor stood up, brushed himself off, and tried again. Failed again. Tried a 3rd time. Failed a 3rd time. On the 4th attempt, he adjusted his approach slightly and succeeded, landing smoothly on the far platform. "I have done this maneuver thousands of times," Kelthor said, "but it has been many years. My body is older. I must relearn. This does not shame me, it teaches me. Now you try." Jake tried, failed, tried again, failed worse, kept trying. After 50 attempts, he managed to grab 2 of the 3 grip points before falling. It was progress. "Good," Kelthor said. "You fail better each time. This is how warriors are made." Lisa Chen was also training with Kelthor now, invited after she showed the same persistent determination that had caught his attention in Jake. Together, the 2 humans learned the Vrax way of combat. They learned that size did not matter if you understood leverage. They learned that strength did not matter if you understood timing. They learned that speed didn't matter if you understood prediction. But most importantly, they learned that being human was not a disadvantage. It was simply a different set of tools, and tools were only as good as the warrior who wielded them. 3 months after the trial of blood, Commander Thorak approached Kelthor with a concern. "The other recruits are beginning to feel inadequate," the commander said. They train all day and see these humans, who should be the weakest among us, improving at rates that seem impossible. It affects morale. Kael'thor considered this. Then teach them what I teach the humans. Talent is common. Will is rare. Those who have both become legends. Those who have only talent become merely good. Good is not enough for warriors of the Coalition. The next day, Kael'thor opened his morning training sessions to any recruit who wished to attend. Dozens showed up, curious and hopeful. Most left after the first week, unable to maintain the pace. But some stayed. Terran stayed. Zarix stayed. Even Vorak from Squad Omega came, his injured leg no longer an excuse but merely another obstacle to overcome. And in the center of it all, Jake Martinez trained with a focus that bordered on meditation. He was no longer the joke of the academy. He was no longer the weak human who did not belong. He was a student of Kael'thor, the endless night, learning to become something more than he was born to be. He was becoming a warrior. The alarms woke everyone at once, their harsh sound cutting through the early morning quiet of Sentinel Prime. Jake rolled out of his bunk immediately, training and instinct taking over before his mind fully processed what was happening. Around him, Squad Omega did the same, moving with the efficiency that months of brutal training had instilled in them. All recruits report to briefing hall immediately. Commander Thorak's voice boomed through the station's communication system. "This is not a drill! Repeat, this is not a drill!" The briefing hall was chaos. Hundreds of recruits crowded in, all talking at once. Their voices creating a noise that made it hard to think. The instructors shouted for silence, but it took Commander Thorak stepping forward, his massive presence finally commanding attention, for the room to quiet down. "A Kryndax separatist faction has attacked Research Station Delta in the Outer Rim," Thorak announced without preamble. "Coalition forces are responding, but the station is under heavy assault and there are over 3,000 civilians trapped inside. The Defense Fleet has requested assistance from Sentinel Prime. All trainee squads will be deployed to support evacuation efforts." The room erupted again, this time with a mix of fear and excitement. This was what they had trained for, but none of them had expected it to come so soon. They were still recruits, still learning, still making mistakes in simulations. Now those mistakes could mean lives lost. "You will be assigned to experienced officers who will command your operations," Thorak continued. "Your role is to follow orders, support the evacuation, and stay alive. The Separatists are well-armed and extremely hostile. This is not training. You can die today. Do not forget that." Squad Omega was assigned to Lieutenant Dax, a veteran Pelion with gray fur and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything at once. They gathered in the shuttle bay with their gear, checking weapons and equipment with hands that shook slightly. Jake noticed that even Vorak, who always acted fearless, was breathing faster than normal. Lisa caught Jake's eye. "Ready for this?" she asked quietly. "No," Jake admitted, "but we go anyway." The shuttle flight to Research Station Delta took 2 hours. 2 hours of silence, each recruit lost in their own thoughts, preparing for what was to come. Through the viewport, Jake could see other shuttles from Sentinel Prime, a small fleet carrying soldiers who were barely trained, flying toward a battle they might not survive. Research Station Delta was a massive structure built into an asteroid, with sprawling laboratories and living quarters designed to house thousands of scientists and their families. When Squad Omega's shuttle approached, they could see the damage. Entire sections were vented to space, their windows blown out. Small attack craft swarmed around the station like angry insects, exchanging fire with Coalition defenders. "Listen up," Lieutenant Dax said as they prepared to dock. "Our objective is Section C residential area. There are approximately 200 civilians trapped there. The Separatists are between us and them. We establish a perimeter, hold it long enough for the civilians to reach the evacuation shuttles, then we fall back. Simple in theory, difficult in practice. Stay together, watch your corners, and do not be heroes. Understood? Understood, sir, they responded in unison. The docking was rough, the station's systems damaged and barely functioning. They entered the door through an emergency airlock into a corridor that was dark except for emergency lighting. The air smelled like smoke and burned metal. In the distance, they could hear weapons fire and screaming. Lieutenant Dax moved them forward in standard formation, experienced soldiers on point, recruits supporting from behind. They encountered their first Separatist patrol 3 minutes after entering. The fighting was nothing like the simulations. It was loud, confusing, and terrifying. Weapons fire lit up the dark corridors in bright flashes. Someone screamed. Jake could not tell if it was from his squad or the enemy. When it ended, one of the Separatists was down and the others had retreated. Nobody on Jake's team was seriously hurt, but the reality of combat had settled on them like a cold weight. This was real. People were trying to kill them, and they had just killed someone. They pushed forward, fighting through 2 more patrols before reaching Section C. The civilians were barricaded inside, frightened and desperate, women clutching children, old people who could barely walk, scientists who had never held weapons looking at the soldiers with hope and fear. We need to move them in groups, Lieutenant Dax decided. The route back to the shuttles is not secure. We will establish waypoints, hold each position while the civilians pass through, then fall back to the next position. Squad Omega, you hold the first waypoint. It is a maintenance junction with good defensive positions. Set up there and prepare for contact. Squad Omega moved to the junction, a wide space where 3 corridors met. There were control panels and equipment lockers that provided some cover. They set up their positions, each member finding a spot that gave them clear lines of fire. Jake checked his weapon again, his hands steadier now. Fear was still there, but so was focus. The first group of civilians came through, escorted by other squads. Squad Omega held their position, weapons ready, scanning for threats. The civilians moved past them in frightened silence, parents carrying children, people helping the injured walk. Then the Separatists came. They came in force, more than Squad Omega had faced before. A full combat unit, armed with military-grade weapons and moving with coordination that spoke of professional training. Lieutenant Dax's voice crackled over their communicators. All squads, multiple hostile forces converging on your position. Reinforcements are coming, but they are 10 minutes out. Hold that position. Do not let them through to the civilians. 10 minutes might as well have been an hour. The fighting was intense, the Separatists trying to push through the junction while Squad Omega fought to hold them back. Quillix worked the control panels, sealing doors and rerouting power to give them advantages. Drashin used his 3 arms to operate a heavy weapon, laying down suppressing fire. Vorak fought with savage efficiency, his injured leg forgotten in the heat of combat. Lisa moved like water, fast and unpredictable, her shots finding targets with deadly accuracy. And Jake adapted. He saw the patterns in the enemy's attacks. He noticed that they always pushed hardest on the left corridor because it had better cover. He noticed that they retreated slightly before using explosives. He noticed the subtle coordination between their units, and he used that knowledge. "They are going to push left with an explosive in 30 seconds, Jake called out. "Quillix, can you vent that corridor?" "Maybe," the Pelion responded, his hands flying over the controls. "Yes, I can override the safety locks." "Wait for my signal," Jake said. "Everyone, focus fire on the center and right corridors. Make them think we are weakest on the left." It was a risk. If he was wrong, they would be overrun. But Jake had learned from Kael'thor that adaptation meant taking calculated risks. He watched the enemy movement, waited for the right moment, then shouted, "Now!" Quilix hit the override. The left corridor vented to space for 3 seconds, long enough to disrupt the separatist attack, but not long enough to cause permanent damage. The enemy forces were thrown into confusion. Squad Omega capitalized on it, their focused fire driving the separatists back. But then something went wrong. A stray shot hit a fuel line. Fire erupted across the junction, spreading fast. The flames cut off their retreat route and threatened to reach the civilians who were still moving through the adjacent corridors. "We need to fall back," Vorak shouted over the noise of fire and weapons. "We cannot," Jake replied. "There are still people behind us. If we leave, the separatists get through." "Then we die here," Drashin said grimly. Jake looked at the situation, his mind racing. Fire spreading, enemies regrouping for another push. Civilians trapped. No reinforcements for several more minutes. They needed a solution, and they needed it now. He thought about everything Kael'thor had taught him. Adaptation, using the environment, turning disadvantages into advantages. "The fire is spreading toward them faster than toward us," Jake said suddenly. "Quilix, can you control the atmospheric vents?" "Yes, but if I vent the atmosphere, we all die." "Not vent. Redirect. Push the airflow toward them. Make the fire spread their direction instead of ours." Quilix understood immediately. His hands moved across the controls, adjusting vent settings, redirecting airflow. The fire hesitated, then began spreading back toward the separatist position. It created a barrier of flame between the two forces, buying precious time. "Brilliant!" Lieutenant Dax's voice came through the communicator. "Hold for 2 more minutes. Reinforcements are almost there." Those 2 minutes felt like hours. The fire burned, separating them from the enemy but also slowly consuming their oxygen. Jake could feel his lungs starting to burn, each breath more difficult than the last. Around him, his squad was struggling too, but they held. They held because civilians were counting on them. They held because they were warriors, and warriors did not yield. When the reinforcements finally arrived, Squad Omega was barely conscious from smoke inhalation. But they had held the position. Every civilian had made it through. The mission was a success. Jake woke up in the medical bay 12 hours later. His lungs ached and his head pounded, but he was alive. Lisa was in the bed next to him, already awake and looking exhausted. Across the room, the rest of Squad Omega was recovering. They had all survived. Commander Thorak visited them that evening. "You did well," he said simply. "You held an impossible position and saved over 200 lives. The Coalition is grateful. I am grateful." But it was the visitor who came after Thorak that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. Kael'thor entered the medical bay silently, his presence making everyone stop what they were doing. He walked directly to Jake's bed and looked down at the young human who had once been the Academy's greatest joke. "You adapted," Kael'thor said. "You saw the patterns. You used the environment. You refused to yield even when death was certain. This is what it means to be Vrax. This is what it means to be a true warrior." Then the legendary fighter did something that no one in the galaxy had ever seen him do. He reached into a pouch at his belt and removed a small, ceremonial blade. Before Jake could react, Kael'thor drew the blade across his own palm, marking himself with a fresh scar. Then he reached out and did the same to Jake, the pain sharp but brief. He pressed their bleeding palms together and spoke in his own language, words that the translators rendered with difficulty. "I name you Battle Brother. Your spirit is Vrax. Your courage is eternal. When I return, we fight side by side." Jake stared at him, not fully understanding what had just happened. But Lisa did. She had studied Vrax culture extensively. "He just made you his brother," she whispered. That is the highest honor a Vrax can give. He is claiming you as family. News of what happened spread across Sentinel Prime within hours. By the next day, it had reached Earth. Within a week, the entire galaxy knew. The endless night had named a human as brother. A species that had been dismissed as weak and fragile had produced a warrior worthy of Vrax recognition. Humanity's reputation transformed overnight. Suddenly, other species looked at humans differently, not as soft skins who needed protection, but as potential warriors whose determination could overcome any obstacle. Applications from Earth to the Coalition military increased tenfold. Other species wanted to know what made humans special, what Kael'thor had seen that they had missed. But for Jake Martinez, none of that mattered as much as the moment 3 days later when he was released from medical care. He returned to Training Room 7, his body still sore but his spirit strong. Kael'thor was already there, practicing forms that Jake was beginning to recognize and understand. "You are late," Kael'thor said without looking up. "I apologize, brother," Jake replied, the word feeling strange but right on his tongue. For the first time since Jake had known him, Kael'thor smiled. It was a small expression, barely visible, but it was there. "Good. Now we train. There are many battles ahead, and you have much still to learn." Jake took his position, ready to begin. He had come to Sentinel Prime as a joke, a weak human who did not belong. But he had become something more. Not through natural strength or speed or any advantage of birth, but through the simple choice to get back up every time he fell, to learn from every failure, and to never accept that his limits were permanent. He had become a warrior, and warriors, as Kael'thor had taught him, were not born. They were made, one choice at a time, one challenge at a time, one refusal to quit at a time. The training began. Brother beside brother, human and Vrax. Two warriors bound not by species, but by shared spirit, and in the vastness of space, on a station filled with soldiers from 100 worlds, the legend grew of the Terran youth who earned the respect of the galaxy's greatest fighter simply by refusing to give up.